My name is Stephanie Boozer. I'm with CUGC HQ and I'm happy to welcome you to today's user share. This is our first user share of 2020, so that's exciting. We've got a slow start to the year with webinars. I think there was a lot going on, so now we're about to get into a heavy webinar season, and I'm really excited to start out our user shares with this one. Before we dig into it, I want to go over a couple of housekeeping details for you. First of all, just want to make you aware of two of our upcoming Excel events. For those of you who are in the Omaha area, we have CUGC Excel Great Plains on April 2nd. And we also have our Southwest Excel, which is April 17th in Scottsdale, Arizona. That is a great way to kickstart the EUC Masters retreat. I can't even get that out. I'm going to put the links in the chat for you right now, just so you can get some more information about those events. But those are great day-long events, awesome speakers, great content, great ways to network and learn. So hope you'll find out about those. Also, just let you know, today's webinar is being recorded. You will receive a link to the recording via email tomorrow. That email will come directly from GoToWebinar, just so you know, and it should arrive sometime tomorrow afternoon, about 24 hours after this webinar ends. We do want you to submit your questions today. I know that James has a lot of material to get through, and I think he's trying to pack a lot in our hour, so he may be going fast and furious, but we will try to take questions if we can. So do type those in the chat, and if we can't get to them all today, we'll get them to James offline, and hopefully he can get answers out after the fact. And finally, at the end of the webinar, I'll be putting a link in the chat for a very quick anonymous survey for you to fill out. Like I said, it's short, it's anonymous, and it's just for CUGC use only. So look for that. All right, so on our call with us today is Jake Walsh. He is going to be moderating all those questions that you type in the question box. Jake is a Citrix technology advocate. He's based out of the UK. Jake, would you like to say hello?
Yeah, hi everyone. So my name is Jake Walsh. I'm a CTA based in the UK. I'm a technical consultant. I work for CDW. I'll be taking some of the questions today and just helping answer those. I had the pleasure of seeing a couple of James's presentations actually at the UK Citrix user groups, and they are awesome. So I think you'll really enjoy this. Hopefully I can help answer some questions, and yeah, just once again, thanks CUGC for putting this on.
Thanks, Jake. All right, and without further ado, I'd like to introduce our presenter, James Rankin. He is a CTP, Citrix Technology Professional. He's also an EUC Solutions Architect, and he is part of the UK CUGC Steering Committee. So with that, James, like I said, I know you have a lot to get through in this hour, so I'm going to go ahead and send the screen over to you so that you can get us going here. All right, you should see this controls coming your way.
Okay, Coke, can you see my screen okay there? I knew it would go the wrong way around. Has it gone the wrong way around?
Yeah, it's in that.
Is that better?
There you go.
Excellent. I knew it was going to do that. I even changed it in advance. There you go. Right, let's crack on then. Yes, as I've just been introduced there, my name's James Rankin. I'm a Citrix CTP. I've got my Twitter handle there, my website at james-rankin.com. I've got a YouTube channel down there as well. I originally did this presentation at the Norwegian user group, which was held in Sweden, rather bizarrely, and it was 4 hours long originally, this presentation. So I'm going to try and get through as much as possible. I've tried to really condense it down, so apologies if I talk too quickly. As I said, if there's questions coming in, please just, throw them in as we go. But if you're kind of touching on a subject I'm going to pick up later, it may be that myself or Jake just tell you to hang fire until the subject comes up. So without further ado, let's crack on. And I'm just going to try and help you learn a few things based on my experience that I've had when coming to deal with Citrix Logon optimizations. So first thing is to talk about why are logon times so important to us, right? Well, everything is about user experience these days, and not just user experience, not just UX. There's also a thing called AX as well, which is admin experience. You know, your admins are users too, and they've got to be able to do their jobs without, you know, with as little interruption as possible. So user experience is very, very, very important. In fact, it's possibly one of the most important things. Well, maybe alongside security, but that's a whole other presentation. Quick plug, myself and Dave Brett on June the 4th, we'll be talking about security versus usability on Citrix platforms. But user experience has to be at the heart of everything you do. And if you have a bad user experience, you get your users up in arms about it, basically, and they'll become kind of dissatisfied. You know, you may get them doing things like provisioning their own stuff. They might go and put stuff in Dropbox or something like that, which gives you DLP issues. You know, if the user experience is bad, you get lost productivity, wasted work time. You know, employees get stressed out. They might even leave if the user experience is that bad that it makes it very, very difficult for them to get their jobs done. Another thing that it can do is it can cause really negative perceptions of the IT department as well. So user experience is kind of, it's sometimes a little difficult to kind of define, but it really, the KPIs that make it up, certain technical solutions can look at the performance of an environment and kind of bring together these key performance indicators to indicate whether your users are having a good time or a bad time. I mean, you can't cover everything here, right? A user might have an uncomfortable chair, for instance, which affects the user experience, which is not something that we can deal with. But we can get an overview of the technical things in the environment that tell us what the performance is like. Now, obviously, things like logon times, which we're going to talk about, you've got application launch times, interactions in those applications. So for instance, if a user goes and opens a file lots of different times a day, if that starts taking longer than usual, it makes user experience degrade. Anything that they do as part of their jobs, you know, running reports, things like that. Excuse me. One thing that a lot of people forget about, how long does it take to print things, particularly in virtualized environments? Printing can often be a key point. But the key thing is, when talking about logon times, is logon times are really at the heart of this, because a logon is usually a user's first interaction with a system, yeah, and it colors their opinion of it from a very early stage. And you've all heard the story of the guy, you know, who goes in on a morning and he logs onto his machine, and it takes so long to log on, he can go off and make a cup of coffee and come back. So that's all wasted time, wasted money. And, you know, it can even go any further than that, not just about money. I did some work recently for a healthcare trust where they wanted to shave some seconds off their logon time because it was literally, you know, it could be a life or death situation when talking about how long it took them to open up a particular application or something like that. So it's not, as I say, it's very, very key to a lot of businesses. And I think it always will be one of the #1 KPIs when it comes to assessing the performance of any system. So the first sort of key takeaway to mention is put user experience at the heart of everything that you do and a commitment to making it better all the time. And as I say, logon times are one of the key performance indicators out there. Now, I did a presentation at Bry Forum back in about 2015, which seems like much longer than that ago now, where I was talking about failures of virtualization projects. And I came up with the 9 circles of user experience hell, which is a bit of a nod to Dante Alighieri's The Divine Comedy, which is one of my favorite books. But I've got time to go through all of those. But I've just highlighted the ones there, which, you know, when it comes to logon times, planning, baselining, testing, and monitoring are very, very important when it comes down to logon times, because you always need to get hard numbers, right? You can't take a user's word for it when they say, oh, the logon's poor, etc. One man's fast is another man's slow. And that can also be relative, because I deployed a solution recently where the initial logon time was 2 minutes before I'd done any optimizations. But the users told me they thought it was lightning fast, but that was only because the previous solution that they had was so poor. So it's very important to do things like planning and baselining and doing your testing properly. And also, especially what I'm going to talk about now, is monitoring. Lots of projects I work on, there's no monitoring in place, and it sounds like 101, but it is so frustrating when you can't not just capture baselines, you can't view trends, you can't do real-time monitoring, you know, you can't react to anything as it happens. And it's very important to focus your monitoring on the client end rather than the infrastructure end, because that's where the users are interacting, that's where they're having their logons, that's where they're having any issues. So rather than focusing on, databases and networks and storage, you also need to focus on the client end as well and monitor for everything you can that can adversely affect that user experience. So just a quick call out here. Obviously, I haven't got any time to do a bake off of any of these sorts of things, but in my sort of time working with Citrix, these are some of the bits of software that I've used that have helped me to understand things like logon times and be able to assess them and monitor them and trend them and things like that. So systrack, control up, EG Innovations, NextThink. Obviously, we're all probably very familiar with Citrix Directory. You've also got analytics now. Liquidware Labs have Stratosphere. Right, so we've got SCCM and OMS. There's FlexEra, Goliath Technologies, loads and loads of people in that space that can help out. What's also very important to talk about here when talking about logons is a lot of these pieces of software also understand the Citrix side of things. So a logon isn't just the Windows logon. When you're using a Citrix environment, that initial part where, the Citrix infrastructure brokers the connection and things like that, that is also considered by the user part of the logon time. So it's important to have a piece of software that understands that side of things as well and can give you the right numbers around that. So a second kind of key takeaway for us in there, your monitoring is vital. It's vital that it's done on the client end as well as the kind of server infrastructure end. And it's important that you use something that understands that Citrix part of the environment as well. So, any of you over a certain age may remember Brian Madden and Kevin Goodman coming up with this diagram, which is a full breakdown of a XenApp 5 logon, which is remarkably complex. And obviously, we will be sending out the slides later, so you can probably blow that up and have a good dig through it to see, just what goes on during the Citrix Logon process. However, we're not going to sit and use that for this presentation because we could probably spend all day going through that. And I've got a bit more of a simplified sort of look at it down here. This is kind of what happens in a logon process. These stages here, these kind of 6 stages are sequential, so they all follow on after each other. And obviously what we're talking about here are Windows logons. So if you're looking for a run through of a Linux VDA logon optimization, this is probably not the presentation for you. So at first, we get the brokering and session initialization, which is where your Citrix license is validated, it brought us a connection to a server under, that isn't under too heavy a load and things like that. Launches winlogon.exe and then takes you to the next stage, authentication. Now at this stage, if you're using pass-through or single sign-on, obviously the Citrix broker will then pass across your credentials at that point for authentication. If you're not, I can't imagine why you wouldn't be, but if you're not, you would have to actually go and type your credentials in here. You'd be validated. Now Windows starts measuring the logon time at this point, and it also validates your RDSH license here, which is why, as I said, it's important to make sure you've got something that understands the stuff that's already gone on before that. Now, once that's done, the next stage is a user profile will be located and loaded, or it'll be created and loaded. And then after that, we move on to user group policy processing. The policies are fetched, they are run, and they are completed. After that, we have a stage called user init, where essentially it prepares itself for the final launch. It establishes any network connections, runs active setup, and maps any printers. And finally, you have the shell stage, where it runs, whatever the shell is, which 99.999 times out of 100 is going to be Explorer, and then, or if it's not a desktop that you run at that point, it runs the program from the command line. Now, as I said already, the Citrix broker infrastructure does all sorts of stuff before we even get passed across to that authentication stage, validates licenses, assesses loads, worker uptimes, things like that, connection status, power status. This little diagram here shows if you've got a persistent VM, that's assigned to a particular user on a one-to-one basis, if it's not powered on and registered, it'll have to power it on. And this sort of stuff that's going on the Citrix side is why it's essential to measure those logons from that Citrix rather than a Windows perspective. So I do remember now that I was supposed to put an image in there. So when I was condensing things down to make it look less rubbish on there, but there you go. I have been completely found out there, forgetting to put an image in. Literally just a couple of words to talk about persistence versus non-persistence. Most of your Citrix virtual apps and a significant portion of your Citrix virtual desktops are non-persistent. Persistent logons, obviously, by their very nature, are generally quicker because you've normally got the profile stored on the device. However, from the perspective of everything I've done in this presentation, I've looked at non-persistent right across the board, because in XenApp kind of environments, most things are non-persistent. A lot of virtual desktops are as well. So it's important to look at it from that perspective. So we're looking at it mainly from a non-persistence perspective. Before we start to talk about how long is a good logon, most people, Citrix included, go by what they call the rule of 30. They will class 30 seconds or less as a good logon. However, I always try and set my sights pretty high and aim for kind of like 10 seconds or less. It's not always achievable, but like they say, if you aim high and you fall a bit underneath, then you're obviously going to be better off than if you'd aimed a bit lower. Another kind of challenge that you might want to set yourself is that you should consider, even if you've got infrastructure issues, even if you're running less than capacity, or if you're having issues or load issues, you should try and aim for something like a minute should be the maximum possible logon time for you to achieve with the users. That is considerably more challenging depending on what part of your infrastructure you're going to fail or simulate a load on. But it's a good way to take it, to set yourself really high standards, and from there seeing what you can achieve. So I did some baselines over the last week because it was a long time since I'd done this presentation, so I thought I'd go and do it. And in my own lab, bearing in mind, and I've just had a lovely new lab delivered today, so these numbers will probably improve over the next few weeks. But Windows 10 1909, basically fully patched, no optimization, Office, a few app apps, no profile management, and antivirus installed. Took us a ridiculously 261 seconds for a logon, which is just awful. Windows Server 2019, obviously on my XenApp instances, was considerably better, 52.7. but still not great. So those are the kind of baselines that I ended up working from to try and improve. And I think you all probably know why Windows 10 is so dire, but obviously we will touch on that in a bit as to how to get around it. Just a quick diagram here. The red is the logon time for a non-persistent machine, and the yellow is the size of the profile. You can see from Windows NT onwards through Windows XP and even Windows 7 that it was always pretty good. It started creeping up around Windows 8. Then Windows 10, we have this huge jump, and we're back down to a fairly reasonable level for 2016 and 2019. Although, as I said, 50 seconds plus still isn't great from a perspective considering that. But yeah, it's worth noticing that whatever they did with Windows 10, which I'm sure you all know what it is, really contributed to a huge uptick in logon times and profile sizes, which obviously, as you can tell by the shape of the graphs, are intrinsically linked. Now, a good point to call out from my experience is most of your logon issues occur, during that logon process of either the group policy processing time or the profile load time. So, excuse me. If you ever go into a place, and they're having logon issues and they've got no data to give you, those are the two best places to actually start looking. So it's probably a good place to start is talking about group policy. I'm assuming you all know pretty well about group policy, so I'm not going to go through a full sort of breakdown of how it works. An interesting thing to call out really is, we have new things coming along like Intune and modern management and desired state configuration, and a lot of people are talking, should we be using these instead of group policy? It's an interesting one. I've seen some Windows Virtual Desktop deployments recently done that were being managed with DSC, but DSC is generally useful for servers, generally not clients, and even XenApp servers, as they are essentially clients in server clothes. You can use desired state configuration on desktops, but you can pound nails with a screwdriver if you want to. It doesn't make it the ideal way to go about things. But according to Microsoft, they still say that group policy is the way recommended for domain joined clients. And what you shouldn't do is you shouldn't combine what they call competing controllers, such as DSC and group policy, because they'll just fight with each other, essentially. And I know that what we consider of as domain joined machines are kind of changing in the way, AD has become much more federated. It's much more of a subscription mechanism rather than something that you're managed by. But I think as far as we're concerned for now, that group policy, we've invested a lot in it. We've got a lot of complication in it for a lot of us. So I think it's not going to go away anytime soon, and we should still look at it as the main way that we're going to be managing devices for the sort of next few years at least. DSA and Intune will come on, they will pick up, and we may end up having to optimize those a lot more heavily. But for now, I think with that entrenched in group policy, that it's not going to go away. On the left-hand side here, we have a list of what are called group policy client-side extensions, which is a name for modules that sit within the group policy engine. It is a framework that can kind of be extended. For instance, vendors like Citrix have their own group policy CSE modules. And on the right-hand side here, those GP extensions are the nodes that refer to the individual client-side extensions within the registry. Now, the client-side extensions process in a particular order, and basically administrative templates get to go first, and then everything else follows in basically a numerical fashion based around the GUID that they've got, well, numerical or alphabetical, whichever way it goes. Now, interestingly enough, Citrix group policy, because it begins its GUID with a 0, comes in third, so it processes quite high up that list. But if you want to change this, don't think you can just go in and change the GUIDs, because you'll just literally break everything. I have tried that, and it's not to be advised. Now, for each of these client-side extensions, the DLL has to be loaded, initialized, and so on. Group policy preferences, shortcuts, ini files, and environment variables are the CSEs that take the longest to load. So be careful if you're using any of those. Now, the image on the left here is from my lab, and this basically shows a set of group policy objects that have been defined for maximum troubleshooting capability. So the idea is that I've defined them in this way. I've set one setting per object, per group policy object. Now, this isn't really the way you should do it, because, but it does make troubleshooting much more easily. However, each client-side extension, ideally for the best possible performance, you should load all the settings from each client-side extension into a single GPO where it's been applied. Now, when you think that admin templates are a client-side extension of their own, you can imagine that these GPOs are going to get very, very big. So the way I try and do it is, I say in development and test and things like that, I use one setting per GPO, because then I can quickly and easily find out where the problems are when it comes to group policy objects. However, in production, where I want the best possible performance, then I have to load as many client-side extensions into each GPO that's applied there within them. So you have much more bigger monolithic GPOs for better performance. Now, an interesting thing as well is often a lot of people, for instance, if they've got a GPO configured that just has computer config settings in, they used to go in and change the status here so that user config would be disabled. The thought was that it would, not have to load as much and it would be processed faster. It actually doesn't make any difference. So if I've ever advised you to do that at any point, please accept my apologies. It doesn't matter what you set that to. The whole GPO has got to be loaded before that's read in anyway, and it knows there's any difference. In fact, the only use I see for this is if in production you have very big GPOs, as you do, as I've just advised you to do there. What happens is you can then disable essentially the computer config or the user config when it comes down to troubleshooting. So that's the only real use that I generally see for that. Now, we're talking Citrix environments, so loopback processing is very commonly used in Citrix environments. It's my favorite interview question when I'm interviewing people to see if they know what they're talking about. And it basically lets you apply user config items based around where the computer object that the user is logging into. Now, you have two options with loopback processing. You have replace mode and you have merge mode. Now, replace mode works when the user logs into a computer enabled for loopback. Instead of getting the user policy settings from their user accounts location, they get the user settings from GPOs that apply to the computer object. However, if you select merge mode, first the normal user settings from the user object are processed, and they then process any user settings in GPOs that are applying to the computer object. And if there are any conflicts, the computer linked GPO user settings override the user ones. Now, obviously, as you can probably tell from that, if merge mode is enabled, essentially this means that you're going to apply group policy twice. It's going to do it in 2 passes, and henceforth your logon is going to take longer. So the key thing with loopback is always use replace mode, and your logon processing will be better. Quick note about group policy preferences printers. It can take some time to install a printer driver, and especially if the printer item is set to replace, that means it'll reinstall the printer driver every time it runs. So always, if you're using group policy preferences printers, set it to create or update instead. Now, this is a good point, and I think Jack, our moderator, I remember him suggesting the same sort of thing in a presentation he did once. Is computer config versus user config. Now, you can also do these with registry settings as well. So imagine you've got a computer config item like, a user config item like autoplay here, which you want turned off, and you generally want this turned off for all users. Now, why would you set this, if you want it set for all users, as a user policy? Because that means every time each user logs in, they've got to apply this user policy as part of their logon. If you apply it on a computer level, that'll turn it off for all users regardless, and that'll be processed when the computer boots up rather than when the user logs on. So henceforth, it'll save you having to apply that object. And the interesting thing is, even some things that are some group policies that are supposed to be user only, if you actually download the group policy templates and have a look at the registry keys in that spreadsheet that tells you all of the settings, you can literally just change the HK count user to HK local machine sometimes. And even though it's not documented, you can apply them as a computer object instead. The same thing applies to any registry settings you may need to apply for your users. If you can apply them as HKLM instead, if it needs to apply to all users, then go ahead and do it like that. So all of the processing is essentially done at boot rather than, when the user logs on. So it saves you time there. Now, one thing that is absolutely crucial to your GPO processing is filtering. You kind of have 3 levels of filtering. First one you have is obviously security filtering, which you can only do by user or by group, and that literally translates to NTFS permissions on the GPOs. There's no overhead with security filtering because the group policy engine just looks at the GPOs, and if it can read them, it can read them. If it can't, it can't. Wmi filtering has slightly more overhead. Some of them can adversely affect group policy processing, especially LDAP queries or product queries, which I think Microsoft have recommended for a long time that you don't use at all. So be a bit more careful with Wmi filters, and if possible, get rid of them. And obviously in group policy preferences, you also have item level targeting, which you can apply. Item level targeting can be really quite intensive with the processing, particularly OU, LDAP query, domain, site, or computer security groups. This, you can get rid of it. If you can, try and get rid of some of these. It can be difficult to replace this with security filtering, but it is what it is. If you want the fastest possible logon times, you really need to reduce the amount of filters you've got. And that kind of leads us on quite nicely to group policy design and structure, because if you have a very flat OU structure, essentially what you do is you introduce a big reliance on filtering, especially complex filtering. And I think that really, really needs to be avoided. You should try and nest a lot of OUs, properly divide everything up, make sure you don't have group policy objects that are linked to lots of different places. And if you need to do any filtering, see if you can do it by security filtering only. Another thing you need to be important when it comes to group policy design is to review your group policies on an ongoing basis. I have lost track of the number of places I've been to where they've got hundreds of group policy objects that apply to Windows XP, and they're all running Windows 10. And the group policy engine isn't clever enough to decide if the operating system matches the policy object. It will be applying all of those group policy objects, and they'll just be being ignored because they don't work anymore. So review them, get rid of them, remove unlinked ones, remove ones that don't apply to you anymore. Another thing that's interesting is a lot of places I go, I see everyone's got access to group policy in the IT department, and somebody could go in and misconfigure something and wreck everybody's logons with a bit of a fat finger. So why not download something like Advanced Group Policy Management, which gives you change control and the ability to lock GPOs and check them in and check them out and things like that. That's another good tip for keeping your group policy from being wrecked by somebody who doesn't know what they're doing. Now, another interesting bit about group policies to talk about synchronous versus asynchronous mode. Now, asynchronous mode, if you can enable it, takes quite a chunk off your logon time. In fact, it took nearly 40% off the logon times in my testing compared to running in synchronous mode. Now, when a user's logging in, one of my test users here with a bizarre name, if it's in synchronous mode, you'll see a screen like this, which means that the group policies are being applied sequentially, yeah? If it's running in asynchronous mode, which means they're not being applied sequentially, you'll just see a black screen as you log in. And asynchronous mode is much faster. Well, technically it's not much faster. What it does is it'll present the desktop before group policy processing is actually finished. Whereas in synchronous mode, it insists on finishing group policy processing before it presents to the desktop. So if you can get into asynchronous mode, then basically it's going to be a lot faster for you. But to understand that, you need to understand foreground processing and background processing. Foreground processing occurs when you log in, and that can be done asynchronous or synchronous. Background processing occurs when group policy is refreshing during the session, and that's always done asynchronously. However, certain client-side extensions require synchronous mode. Now, if this happens when you're logging in foreground processing, if one of these CSAs applies, it will force synchronous mode. If one of these CSAs tries to apply when it's doing background processing, it won't go to synchronous mode, it'll be asynchronous, but it will force the next logon to be done synchronously. So the key is, which ones of the client-side extensions try and force you into synchronous mode? Folder redirection does, software installation policies do, I think disk quotas did, although I'm not sure that they're even still a thing anymore. And group policy preference drive maps used to, but since Windows 8, they don't. So mainly folder redirection and software installation policies are the two you want to be aware of. Now, if you want to force asynchronous mode or have the capability to log in with asynchronous mode, firstly, you need to configure these two GPOs. So first one is always wait for the network at computer startup and log on. You need that to be disabled. The second one is called allow asynchronous user group policy processing when logging on through remote desktop services, and that needs to be set to enabled. Now, if you're on a server operating system, you can't have asynchronous mode. You can only have synchronous mode unless you've got RDSH installed and you've also got these two group policies configured. So you need to configure these if you're on XenApp and make sure that you obviously, well, you would have, if you're on XenApp, you would have the RDSH role installed on there. The only time this wouldn't happen is if you're using a server operating system with the VDA installed with the server VDI switch to give you a one-to-one VDI based on server 2016 or 2019, like Amazon Workspaces, for instance. You can't get asynchronous mode on those, so that's a bit annoying. But for XenApp, you can do it if you enable those two GPOs. However, there are some caveats which are mentioned in the documentation around this. Now, one of them says if you've got a home drive or a roaming profile path or a logon script, you can't log on in asynchronous mode. Actually, that's not true. You can. So that documentation needs updating. However, if a user hasn't logged onto a machine before, user policy processing is always synchronous. Now, I wondered how the machine figured out that you'd logged on before, and luckily it's not measured by a profile or a cached credential. It actually looks at some registry keys. So if you're clever about it, if you edit your default profile and you add in these two registry keys that are mentioned at the bottom down here, the system will then think when it reads these registry keys that a user has actually logged onto the machine before, and it will then, as long as the GPOs are set from the previous slide, it will then let you log in asynchronous mode, which is great because it logs on a lot faster. As I said, the Microsoft documentation says if any of these things are set that are highlighted here, that you can't log on in synchronous mode, but that is literally not true. The only thing you need to worry about is setting those two registry keys in there. Obviously, Microsoft haven't updated their documentation. But as I mentioned, drive mappings only if you're on a Windows version earlier than Windows 8. Would that force synchronous mode? So most of you should be okay. If you are on an earlier version of Windows, well, you've got more work to do than forcing asynchronous mode, I guess. Software installation policies will force synchronous mode, so don't use software installation policies. I hope there's not many people out there using GPO software installation policies because they're very old and very clunky. However, folder redirection is probably the one that you're going to find because folder redirection policies force synchronous mode. However, if you do instead of setting folder redirection through the GPOs, if you set it via just setting the registry keys in HK current user, etc., Explorer, user shell folders, if you set folder redirection in there, then it doesn't count as being done by the GPO, so you can have asynchronous mode if you do your folder redirection like that. It does mean that you don't get any of this sort of stuff that's just popped up there, such as moving stuff around when you redirect it, changing the permissions, but folder redirection also is something that I'm not particularly keen on anyway when it comes to improving logon times. But as I say, if you have got it configured, try and use the registry item instead. If you're using Citrix UPM, obviously if you're using a UPM template profile, you'd need to put those 2 registry keys in to fool the system into thinking you've logged on before. Secondly, don't use home drive for the UPM profile path. That seems to knock it into synchronous mode. So if you use a UNC path with one of the variables, %username or #SAM account name, that should get you around that. Also, don't use the Citrix policies to enable folder redirection because they're the same as the Microsoft policies and they'll knock you into synchronous mode instead as well. If you want to check that you're in asynchronous or synchronous mode, the event log is obviously your friend. Go to the group policy operational log, filter by event ID 5340, and each logon it'll tell you, and that's what you want to look for. Group policy processing mode, foreground asynchronous means it's good. You'll be able to tell because it'll just have a black screen as you log in, and it should be a lot faster. There's a summary there of everything that you need to do to get it done, but another key takeaway there, asynchronous processing makes a hell of a difference to your logons, particularly on Citrix virtual apps, because you don't have the benefit of being able to get rid of certain things on Windows 10 when you're on Citrix virtual apps, because normally you're on a server operating system, at least you are at the moment. And that makes a good difference. As I said, took about 40% off my server 2016 logon times, so it was very, very impressive. Logon Scripts. Lord, are we still talking about Logon Scripts? Well, yes, we are. I've just worked with a customer who had 4,000 interlinked Logon Scripts. Imagine that. Absolutely awesome. Logon Scripts have a 10-minute timeout if they go wrong, so you really don't want them in there if there's any potential for them to go wrong. Since Server 2012, Logon Scripts don't actually execute at Logon anyway. You need to configure a GPO to make them execute at Logon. But really, we should be avoiding them now. Config items should be handed off to GPP or Wmi or any other tool that you've got. Some people say, yeah, but you can enable asynchronous Logon Scripts. That just means multiple Logon Scripts are asynchronous. And what do Logon Scripts do? You know, do you map drives and printers? I'm going to talk more about mapping drives in a bit, but we can get away from that. If you must use them, run them in PowerShell, and also use a logon.cmd, which is called by the app setup area of the registry. That's another old thing that we could do with getting rid of. Just a quick thing there. If you can't get rid of Logon Scripts, you can kind of disable them using this little trick to tell it not to call them, or you could just write something into your Logon script to say, if I'm an ICA session, then terminate or something like that. So yeah, get rid of it. Now, quickly moving on from kind of where Logon Scripts lead us, because that's always talking about drive mappings and things like that. There's a great article here that you probably should read called The Case of the Very Slow Logons, which is an excellent article when we're talking about logon times, because it tells you how to use Process Monitor, how to monitor a logon, how to run it in session 0. And it's a really good article. Mark Rasinovich writes some great stuff that I'm sure you all know. But I could have saved Mark all this trouble because obviously it was a drive mapping that caused his very slow logons. Drive mappings are a horrendous pain in the proverbials. I mean, a drive mapping, what is it? It's just a shortcut, right, that appears in certain parts of the shell, and it has a letter map to it. But in this day and age, I don't really see why it still needs to be like that, you know. And people have loads of these things. And I think we need to start thinking about weaning ourselves away from drive mappings, because they are an incredibly archaic thing. You can map them in all sorts of different ways. I probably should have taken this slide out because it's just so bad. But drive mappings, right, when you log in, right, a drive mapping validates it when it's mapped, right? So if it'll wait for it to time out. And sometimes this can take ages. And also when you're accessing it within the shell, if a drive mapping is inaccessible, the shell will kind of hang there as well. So it's not great. We actually had a Citrix Cloud issue recently where for some reason, now Microsoft say that drive mappings have a 5-minute timeout when you're logging on. That is not true. We found some inaccessible drives in a cloud environment that I was working in. Because these drives were inaccessible, it was taking 15 minutes to get the timeout back. And by that time, Citrix had long since given up. But the killer thing was these were one-to-one VDIs, so it thought there was a user logged in because it was still trying to map this drive in the background after Citrix had disconnected it. And literally, users couldn't log on until they were rebooted. So it's just a horrendous pain for something that is little more than a shortcut. And lots of people talk about using home drives, but I'm like, yeah, if we don't got OneDrive or ShareFile or some sort of AFSS solution, you've got a home drive. It's called the Documents folder. You know, just redirect that somewhere if you really need to. I think we need to get away from this reliance on things like home drives. And then you've got departmental drives, right, where people go on about, oh, I need to get to my G drive or my H drive or something, you know, that they've come to rely on so much. Now, first of all, we've got things like SharePoint and stuff like that. Can't we do that? Well, some people still insist on having SMB shares. So there's an article referenced here where I've come up with a way of using group policy preferences that lets you create shortcuts to network locations that show in the same places without having to map a drive and without having to take up all that potential time. If you can't do that, then there are other ways you can reduce it down. But say this is, now these aren't mapped drives, these are just network shortcuts, but because of that cleverness that I've done in that article that I haven't got time to go through now, they show up at the exact same places in the shell and they don't have to be validated when you log in. If you can't do that, the other option is kind of rather than mapping several drives to several network shares, as shown in the bit here that says old method, you could instead just map a single drive to a root of a file share and then have folders underneath that you can lock down with NTFS and access-based enumeration. So if you can't get rid of map drives entirely and replace them with shortcuts, then why not do this and just map one drive instead of multiple drives? So if there's any problems with them, you don't get you know, the long delays within there. So I think it's time, this is one of my pet sort of hate things, but review and remediate what you're doing with map drives, because they can be nothing but a big fat pain in the proverbials. Active Directory goes without saying that a good Active Directory is essential for good logon time, so it's essential for good everything, to be perfectly honest. Look up Carl Webster's presentations that he does about AD and Citrix for good guys. I've probably pinched half of them just to throw in here. Obviously, you know, to get the best possible logon performance, get your forest functional level and your domain functional level as high as possible. One that also make sure that all of your domain controllers are global catalogs, because your global catalog lookups are faster, etc., etc. What else do we? Subnet definitions. This one can be particularly painful with logons because if your subnets are not defined correctly, then you'll get a broadcast for one, and you could get one that's in a a long way away, or it's doing a sync, or is under load, or whatever. These things are not sticky anymore, so it wouldn't stay trying to connect to that same one via a broadcast, but it's still not good, and it can still cause problems with your logons. DNS, obviously, DNS configuration is absolutely vital in any environment, so make sure that's all working as expected. Again, when it comes to logon, if you've got things that need to be contacted, it's going to use DNS to try and find what it needs to talk to, etc., etc. So yeah, in the interest of time, very quickly, pay particular attention to your subnets and your DNS, but make sure your Active Directory is optimized. I mean, not just for when you're talking about your logon times, yeah, for everything within the Citrix environment and your entire environment. AD is absolutely crucial. As I said, that covers off group policy and all the stuff that kind of hangs around it. We've also got user profiles. What is the user profile? Well, we all know what it is. It's the kind of intersection of your apps and your data and your machine config items, and it holds all sorts of wonderful and extraneous stuff that the user uses to supplement their kind of their session with a device. Interesting statistic, I did a Windows 10 migration a few years ago now in 4 months, and 41% of the calls we had during that time to the help desk were to do with user profile related issues. We all know that the profile types, you've got a local profile that's stored only on the device, you've got a roaming profile that's stored on a file share and copied back down, you've got a mandatory profile that's a roaming profile that's never saved, the changes discarded, a temp profile, that you get when you can't access a local or a roaming or a mandatory profile, or if there's any other problems setting it up. And we've got all sorts of profile versions. Version 6 is the one that we should be using now, mainly on Windows 10, Server 2016, Server 2019. Now, just talking about profiles, number one, just don't use roaming profiles. Honestly, they have all sorts of problems. Last writer wins, load times quarters, versioning, all that sort of stuff, right? Just don't use roaming profiles unless you have no other choice. In fact, I would rather, if I had no other choice, I would rather not use anything rather than use a roaming profile. They are really a blast from a very distant past. So let's think about what we need to think about with profiles, right? Obviously, local profiles are the fastest to load. Yeah, everybody knows that because they're stored locally on the device and they're written to very, very easily. Not really suitable or scalable unless you're doing persistent. If you are doing persistent, great, you're going to get fantastic logon times with local profiles. However, then the word on everybody's lips these days is obviously FSLogix. FSLogix profile containers is an excellent halfway house, right? You don't get the problems of roaming profiles, and you don't get the limitations of local profiles. The operating system treats them as a local profile. They're centrally manageable, they're multi-session, and they're also addressed as a VHD, which means they're addressed on like a single file kind of block level, which makes them, very much more performant than anything else that you have out there. If you have to use mandatory or Citrix template profiles, here's a hint: store them locally in the golden image and update them, when the machines boot up from a central share, rather than have to go out across the network to grab them. You might have a quick note about FSLogix. I've seen Aaron Parter do a really good article on using FSLogix profiles across multiple OS types by using UEV to inject in application settings on the fly. Another point I'd like to try and really make is that Citrix UPM file-based solutions like Citrix UPM, which is kind of like roaming profiles, just made good, essentially, they're really starting to age really, really badly, especially when you get big files, deep folder structures, and lots of small files. These cause terrible issues within technology like UPM now. I think most of the problems I have in a deployment I'm doing at the minute are related to UPM, in that it's not handling very long file paths. And you've got things like Teams and Slack and Chrome and Eclipse. God, Eclipse Workspace, absolutely awful for that. UPM really struggling to handle that. And the reason why is, if you look at this is a quick graph of logging on to, I think it was a Server 2016 instance. Yes, it was. Now, the first bit on the left there is a profile that had a 1 GB file in it. So just a 1 GB, single 1 GB file, took about 50 seconds to log on. Then I changed that 1 GB file into 10 100 megabyte chunks, and it took about 10 seconds longer to log on. Then I tried to break that 1 GB into 1 kilobyte chunks. That's when I found out, right? Don't ever try and load a million 1 kilobyte files in a profile using something like UPM, because you literally will kill the entire machine. The only test I had managed to successfully do was if I had 3 megabytes of files in a folder in 1 kilobyte chunks, and that took 180 seconds to log on. So it just goes to show you how badly Windows handles lots of files in particular folders. But it also shows this is where things like FSLogix start to shine, because you could have a million files. Well, you probably couldn't have a million files in a folder, to be fairly honest, once it got addressed by that. We have lots of files in a folder, and it won't give you this huge long drag on Logon. And as I said, I've been doing some work with Eclipse Workspace, things like that. There's millions and millions of files in there, and UPM really struggled. Really, I mean, to the stage where it's just, we finally decided we're just going to pop FSLogix in there instead. No matter what you use, exclusion is a very good thing to do for your profiles. You've got to kind of weigh exclusions against management overhead. I mean, the days of things like Ivanti, UWM and things like that, where you had to, account for every single file that you want to put in there, the management overhead really became too much for a lot of people. But still, it's good to redirect some common stuff out of your profiles because it reduces storage. And obviously, even if you're using VHD-based solutions, mounting a 2 GB VHD is bound to be quicker and more efficient than mounting a 200 GB VHD. Aaron Parter, again, a link there to his FSLogix community redirections. Obviously, that's set up for FSLogix, but I literally just take that list and apply it to things like UPM as well. Just don't cut and paste it directly like somebody I know did once, because obviously the variables aren't set in the same way. But yeah, keep your profile size down will also help you reduce your logon times overall. Now, when we're talking about profiles, and you would have to get to this subject on Windows 10, the reason Windows 10 is so terrible is because of UWP apps, right? That's why we got that horrendous first logon when I was doing the testing. Get rid of them. Get rid of them when you are in audit mode, when you sysprep your image, however you do it, get rid of them now. Use a bit of PowerShell, pick them out like that. Get rid of as many as you can. Also, when you're in audit mode, creating a custom default profile is a really good thing to do. You go into audit mode when you reach this stage. I've got a blog about this. Creating a custom default profile is great, because once you've done it and you run sysprep with a copy profile switch, it essentially copies the profile you've just used into the default profile. But you don't stop there. What you need to do is then, he quickly says, get through all this, is quickly allow the machine to boot up and log on, and then essentially take that profile that you've had and you know, cut it down. Essentially do the same kind of sanitization and optimization routines that you would have done on a mandatory profile. Now, I was listing all this out here. Now, I was hoping to get this released today, but Server 2016 has killed me. I've been working on a script that means you don't have to do all this stuff in audit mode. You can literally just take a user, run a script, and it'll convert that into a default profile for us. So please follow me on Twitter or LinkedIn or whatever, because hopefully within the next week, fingers crossed, if I can sort out the problems in 2016, all this profile optimization process for your default profile that's done here, we'll hopefully be able to do it all in a PowerShell script. It's working okay in Windows 10 1909. It's working okay in Server 2019. I wanted to do it for Server 2016 as well, because I know it's quite widely used, and I just can't get it to work. So you can either do all of this stuff yourself or hang fire and hope that my default profile script comes along soon. It's very messy PowerShell, but hopefully I should have that sorted out pretty soon. So profiles wise, the best thing you can do, get rid of all those UWP apps if you're on Windows 10. You know, use an FSLogix kind of VHD profile tool to give you the best sort of chance in there, unless you're using local profiles on a persistent, and use a custom default profile as well. I think UWP apps, a custom default profile, you know, if you do those on Windows 10, you've already hacked about 80% of that horrendous logon time out of there. Quick word about folder redirection, right? Folder redirection needs to be canned the same way as network drives, right? All that stuff that people are redirecting, like desktop and cookies and things like that, and favorites, right? That's all in your user profile, right? Just get your user profile, whack it up in a VHD, put it on some fast storage for high volume access, right? Downloads folder, put that as a scratch area. Don't bother redirecting that. The only redirection you should ever be doing, I guess, is for something like documents and pictures and things like that, right? And you know, if you're using FSLogix, you might be using OneDrive to wrap that up in the container as well, right? Folder redirection needs to die. It really does, along with network drive mappings. Some quick notes there on folder redirection, just pretty much covering what I was saying there. Yeah, get rid of it. VHD mounting should replace folder redirection as much as humanly possible. Right, let's get on to some more stuff now. A lot of these are more general kind of things when talking about performance and things like that. First of all, storage. Use the quickest storage you can. Very good point for Citrix infrastructure. Get all of your Citrix infrastructure servers on the fastest storage possible, because your brokering is going to be faster, your response is going to be faster. Size your storage for peak load. You know, hyperconverged stuff is great. Check all of your storage best practices, all that sort of stuff. Again, some quick notes about MCS. PVS, use caching device RAM with, oh God, sorry, those images are really, really terrible on there. Use caching device RAM with overflow for PVS and with overflow PVS and RAM cache for MCS. You know, you want to reduce the amount of write-out scan. I mean, these are not just specifically logon things, but you know, the faster response you are getting from MCS and PVS systems, then obviously the better your logons and everything else within there is going to be. I had a note from KS Baggerman over at Nutanix talking about Nutanix shadow clones, which apparently you can get up to like a 300% increase in application and logon times using Nutanix shadow clones with data locality. If you get the slides downloaded, there is a link to KS's blog on that. Which is talking about app volumes and shadow clones, but I'm assuming it's quite easily movable across to a Citrix environment. Again, general sort of performance tuning. Tune your hypervisors, best performance base for you know, Zen Server, which is not even called Zen Server anymore. Hyper-V, every one of those. Look up all of the best practices around there. They all have tuning guides out there. The faster your hypervisors run, the faster everything that sits on it will be running, which includes your logons, of course. Now, another important point I've mentioned is the management of the performance, especially of XenApp servers, because if you've got lots of XenApp servers under heavy load, you know, that are hanging, obviously if a new user comes along and tries to log on, then their experience is going to be rubbish. So like I've said several times previously, monitoring is key, right? If a server is under heavy load, you need to know about it. You can use things like Citrix Wmi or Ivanti Performance Manager or some other tool to manage performance, you know, by throttling CPUs and things like that and managing memory. But don't forget, these tools are band-aids. If you get something that keeps happening and it's being flagged by your monitoring tool, get onto the vendor, do a root cause analysis, you know, make sure that you try and get everything sorted out. Ad blockers is a good one to mention. You don't want users going to websites like IGN.com and causing problems for other users logging on just because they're looking at something on the internet. So use things like ad blockers to cut all of that out. I've got some good blog articles on that. Pay attention to hungry applications, Skype, Teams, Slack, Chrome. They're all notorious for eating up lots of resource. Use as many optimizations from Citrix as you can. You can also optionally use content redirection in Citrix policies to offload some of that back to the client if the client can handle it. And that again helps take the load off the server, which is going to make any users logging on have a better, faster experience of that. So make sure your servers are running as lean and mean as possible. Networks, I'm not a network guy by any stretch. Imagine, make sure your networks are really, really, really fast. Don't scrimp on it, make them good, like the rest of everything else. Let's talk about antivirus. I had a story recently, a deployment I was doing last year sometime, where one day we logged in, and the first time you log in, a new user would be okay. Second time you log in after that, it took 20 minutes to log in. Why on earth had this happened? Citrix UPM was being used, and somebody had managed to turn on some kind of antivirus policy that was now scanning not just on the worker end, but it was also scanning on the file server end as well. So that's why the first logon was okay, because it was loading a new profile onto the server. But after that, it was then scanning and locking the files as they were being copied from the file server down to the worker. So it was being double scanned, and just everything took forever, and had 20-minute logons. So again, like network drive mapping, like folder redirection, I think reactive AV is something that needs to die, at least in its current form. I mean, I don't know how that goes with regulation, or if you have cyber essentials or something like that. But listen, if you have to use it, you know, I've only ever known one person say we'll not do it anymore, who were a very brave customer. If you have to use it, get all the exclusions in. If you're using UPM, make sure it's excluded from session host scan if it's enabled on file server. Get exclusions in for everything. Your PVS servers, if you've got delivery controls, videos, everything, every level of the infrastructure. Turn off unneeded parts of the antivirus suite, right? They all try to do far too much. They try to be all things to all men, right? Turn off all the garbage you don't need. Try and concentrate more on detection and response rather than actually scanning each file down to its DNA as it's loaded. You can use application whitelisting. You've got Wmi, you've got AppLocker, Ivanti have application control, yeah. You can use low-level detections. You know, if Bitdefender has host-level antivirus and things like that, so you can scan it at the host level rather than having to do all the work inside the user's session. There's newer security tech out there. Really, we need to revisit reactive AV the same way we need to revisit folder redirection and map drives. Honestly, I know it's not likely to be something you've done soon, but that's got to be the end game about it. You've also got stuff out there like Cisco AMP, Tanium, DLP products, anything else that does deep inspection, right? Make sure that they are excluded from scanning all these bits that they don't need to, and potentially dragging down your users' logons any further. Don't forget about printing. Don't have thousands of printers mapping at log on time. Use a follow me solution, something simple, you know, keep your amount of drivers down. If you do have millions of printers that you've got mapped, why not offload it till afterwards by using Wmi or UWM or even a scheduled task or something like that? Don't forget, people don't log on and print something straight away, right? Generally, they have to open an application first before they print something. So as long as it doesn't take hours to do that printer mapping in the background, then basically, you know, you don't kind of need to do printers at logon at all. As I said, keep the drivers as simple as possible. We have universal print drivers in Citrix and things like that. Microsoft are now getting in the game. They have a service coming up called Universal Print in Azure, which aims to get rid of print servers. I'm not sure how that will affect things. But yeah, don't forget about printing. We as admins often, because we never print anything, do we, forget about it. But yeah, that needs to be taken into consideration. as well. If you're running hosted desktops or Zen Desktop, we have a thing called active setup. You may not recognize these things. It executes per user commands during logon, and it sets up like an initial config for new users. It runs before the desktop appears. It runs synchronously, which means it stops the logon while it's executing. It has no timeout, for God's sake. It's absolutely ridiculous. So if something's, have you ever logged onto a machine and it just sits there at a black screen till you start Explorer? That's because an active setup stub path has got stuck somewhere and timed out, or it's taken a very long time. So what you can do is you can go into the registry in your gold image and delete them all, which is what I do. Don't forget to check the 64 and the 32-bit areas of the registry for anything with stub path. You can disable them using the sysinternals auto runs tool as well if you're not completely a gung-ho cowboy like myself who just goes and delete them. Be very aware, things like Google Chrome will sneak their stub paths back in as well. That happens on a deployment that I'm working on at the minute, so I'm going in tomorrow to kill it completely. So yeah, get rid of as many of those as possible. They will hold your logon up if there are a lot of them there or if they're configured wrongly. Obviously, when we're talking about powering up machines, pre-booting is always a very good thing to do. It's very applicable to Windows 10 because Windows 10 presents the logon dialog a long time before it's sort of all the hard work it's doing after boot is actually finished in the background, which obviously makes it slower to log on. There's lots of different ways to do this, but yeah, get machines powered up at least 10 minutes before your peak usage starts happening. If you're in a cloud environment, you use autoscale and things like that. I had to use this, I pinched this from George Spear's blog. I used this in the field when I was at a healthcare place where they wanted their logons were 10 seconds and they wanted them shorter. It's really weird. If you log onto a machine for the first time, you'll notice that it takes a couple of seconds more than the second logon. I have no idea where this is, but there's a good thing here from George's blog, which I can say what time it is now, so I'm going to just skip quickly through it. You can basically set up an automatic user that logs in and then logs back out, and therefore your first logon is essentially then always a second logon, and it's a couple of seconds quicker. I don't know what the sort of the cause behind that is, but it is actually really a thing, trust me. Windows 10 has an odd way of dealing with firewall rules. It builds up loads of firewall rules. I was going to give you some PowerShell now to get rid of that. However, Microsoft have now fixed this, and there is now an HKLM registry key you can set called delete user app containers on logoff. Set that to 1 and it won't do this anymore. So it'll get rid of all these gunky firewall rules when your user logs off, and it will stop it holding up your logons. Sysinternals auto runs, great tool. Run it on your base image and verify everything that's in there. You will find lots of crap in there, particularly the app setup key where userlogon.cmd hides. That is where sysinternals auto runs comes in handy, so use that. Scheduled tasks, check all your scheduled tasks. Google, for instance, has a scheduled task that Chrome puts in that runs whenever any user logs on. Get all that crap out of there. You don't need it. Another trick you can do, another one I pinched from George, thank you George, is applications preload. I actually know what causes this. Tim Mangan told me when I was at a conference, he said it's because of application prefetching. So essentially a scheduled task at startup loads all of these commonly used pieces of software and then unloads them straight afterwards, and it makes your logon go faster and your application launches go faster as well. Getting close to the end now. Understand any impact you've got on new apps, right? Every time you put a new app in, right, make sure you've dissected that and tested it and observed everything properly. It sounds like I'm teaching granny to suck eggs there, but honestly, amazing how many people forget about it, particularly with things that auto-update. Does the application add a new stub path? Does it add a scheduled task? Does it drop a lot of data in the URL profile? Assess the application, understand what it changes and how you can mitigate it via GPOs or whatever. And some final bits. Custom load evaluator policies, I've seen those affect logons before where they've been set badly and they're directing users away from servers onto ones that are not sufficiently in a state to be able to handle a decent logon. Session pre-launch and linger obviously can really help. You can also try and be clever about disconnect and reconnect, although in many environments with reboot schedules, it's not easy to do. Citrix virtual channels such as printers and audio and client drives, if you're not using them, you can disable them. Make a huge difference to logon times. Citrix policies, treat these like group policy objects with regards to optimization, rationalize them, check them, make sure you're not using ones that don't apply anymore, things like that. If you're using a disclaimer, the thing that pops up and you have to click OK on when you're logging on, they can skew your logon times if the users take a long time to respond to them, if they take 3, 4, 5 seconds, especially in Director that tends to take that into account. when formulating the logon time. Get your Citrix infrastructure, like your AD infrastructure, at the highest level possible. So your brokering is very much improved. Group virtual delivery agents and delivery controllers together in zones to minimize the traffic. And there's a registry value you can set there to 0 if you're using Citrix Direct. It doesn't make it log on any faster, but it makes Director reported as faster. So that's a good way of cheating if you're using Citrix Direct. And finally, optimization tools. Actually, it's not finally. I've got one more slide before this. Citrix Optimizer, Wmi Optimizer, the BizF framework. A lot of the stuff we've just run through there can be done by these tools. The BizF framework particularly needs a call out because it can do lots of other stuff with regard to other applications like FSLogix as well. As always with community tools like this, there are great things to use, but be careful with them, obviously, and don't just go and run them willy-nilly on production platforms and then blame me because I'm not taking any of the responsibility for that. If you're struggling and you need to dig deeper, Process Monitor is your friend. Mark Rasinovic's blog tells you how to use that. Guy Leach has got a lot of good stuff out there about using PowerShell and reading the event logs. Event logs are your friend, right? If you haven't got any monitoring, you can still get the bits you need out of the event logs. There are over 400 event logs now. Read the events in there. They are there for a reason to help you out. So a final key takeaway. Image optimization is crucial. Do it well and do it often. It's not a one-time thing. So when I did my testing and I applied all of these things, my Windows 10 1909, which started on 261.4 settings, which was a bit nasty to Windows 10 because I realized I had it on spinning disks instead of the SSDs, which took quite a bit off there. Not a huge amount, but a sizable amount. We got that down about 10.1 settings average, and we took our server 2019 from 52 down to 8.2, which I know it's just in my lab, and obviously I don't have an extremely complicated application sets out there, but percentage wise, if you can extrapolate that out into your own environments, then you kind of should be good. So just a quick run through of the most key parts. Make sure UX is the heart of everything. Fast storage, group policy, get that asynchronous mode in, that is a big one. Ditch your Logon scripts, ditch folder redirection, ditch drive mappings, kill it all. Kill antivirus as well if you dare. AD, make sure your AD is optimal. Profiles, very, very important. Get a solution in there that works well for that. FSLogix is ideal, apart from the horror stories I've been reading recently about it not applying group policies when you use it, but that's hopefully something to be fixed soon. Get lots of image optimizations in there, apply as much as possible. My God, I can't believe I have rushed through all of that in just over 1 hour. I apologize if that was much too 100 mile an hour for you guys out there, but that's it. That is me.
Wow. Great job, James.
Thank you. I'm now out of breath.
I know we're over the hour. I think Jake was able to answer a lot of the questions in the chat. But if we didn't get to your question, let's see, it looks like a lot of them got answered. What I can do is take, usually we try to get the Q&A, some of it out loud for the recording just so everyone can hear it. But what I can do is pull all this out and as a transcript, and I can put it out at my CUGC, and I can include it with what gets emailed out tomorrow with the recording. So that might be helpful. And then if there are any other resources, James, that you want to include with that, just let me know. I know I've had a couple people ask about the slide deck. I don't know if you're going to make that available. That would be awesome.
Yep, that's not a problem. Yep.
Okay. Jake, did you see anything else that you think is, I know we don't have any more time, but is there anything you want to mention, or are we good to handle it that way?
Yeah, I think James has covered basically everything in existence in that hour.
I didn't mention anything about EDT or anything like that, which I just thought of right at the end, but I'm not even going into it now.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is just shout out to some of the community tools like the BizF. That's awesome. Likewise, do have a look at James's website as well. There's some great resources on there, and feel free to reach out if either of us can help with anything.
It's definitely, especially because of IR35, which I forgot to mention. I'll probably be unemployed next month. So if anybody's got any projects they want doing, feel free to send me an email.
All right, well, I will get all of this packaged up for you all, and I'll have this out to you tomorrow with the recording link. And then I guess that's it. Thank you. Thank you, James, and thank you, Jake, and thanks to all of you for being with us today.
Cool. Thank you very much.
All right, everybody have a great afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Cheers.